All right, so welcome to our November edition of the Movement Nerd Hangout. My name is Monica Volkmar, and I guess some of you know me, some of you don't. But for those of you who don't know me, um, I started my career as a dancer. That went all wrong. Ended up busting my body a little bit, and then I set myself straight by learning how to take care of my body again, recover from the injuries, and that led me into the field of fitness and body work. And what I'd love to share with you today is the role that anatomy in motion played in helping me on that healing path. And anatomy in motion is a way of looking at how the body moves through the gait cycle. So, how we walk, what the body does, and when it does it, what are the mechanics of that with every footstep we take. And we'll be applying that model called the flow motion model of gait, which is the creation of Gary Ward. So, if you haven't ever heard of Gary Ward or anatomy in motion, you might like to explore some of his work after we're finished today. But I think many of you actually already know who he is and what this work is about. So we'll be looking at wake up your butt through the lens of how our glute muscles actually work through the walking cycle, which is a little bit different than how we might go about training them at the gym. So today's intention isn't to strengthen or stretch the glutes, but to understand and feel and explore how our glutes lengthen and shorten with every footstep that we take, considering that the gait cycle is what our bodies are hardwired to do. So it's a very innately natural, I don't like the word natural, but it is a very innately human thing to do based on the structures of our bones and our joints. And so we'll be using that as the context for how to look at the glutes. So what are our intentions for today? Other than that, well, we want to understand what are the glutes. So what exactly are the muscle groups that we're talking about? There are 3 gluteal muscles, and we're just going to not take for granted that anybody or nobody knows what the glutes are. I always want to make sure that we're all on a level playing field to begin with. My perception of what a glute is might be different than yours, and that's okay. But there was this really terrible photo floating around the internet that had the glutes just drawn all wrong. I think some of you saw that photo. And oh my gosh, it just made me like face palm. Like, we just really need to not take it for granted that we all know what a glute muscle actually is. And same with the hip joint. We'll be exploring like what actually is the hip joint, because the hip joint is the primary joint that the glutes pass over top of, which means that how the hip joint moves will directly influence how well we have access to using our glutes. We're going to understand what those 3D motions are of the hip joint. So for those of you who have done my Liberated Body workshop, this will be a bit of a review from day 3, where we covered all the motions of the hips, but we'll be exploring that through the lens of how those 3D hip motions influence and impact on the glute muscles. And we'll be looking at this in primarily a closed chain. So closed chain means with the foot on the ground, not with the leg in the air. And this is a little bit different than how the glutes work when the foot is not on the ground. So it's a very important distinction to make: closed chain versus open chain. And don't worry, we'll go into that a little bit more later on when we get into the lesson. And the idea is that we can use these joint mechanics to show our bodies unconsciously how to access the glute muscles without having to consciously, deliberately squeeze and contract the glutes with our willpower, because that's a very energetically costly thing to have to do all the time. And just to share about when I was first starting in my personal training career, I think I probably wasted hours and hours of time over the course of my, I don't know how many years and hours, but so many times doing glute squeezing, activating exercises with the hopes that then my glutes would be able to work when I was doing my other exercises like squats or deadlifts. And I don't know if it was useful or not because nothing really felt different, but it was just the thing to do in the fitness industry at the time was we need to do glute activation exercises before we work out because otherwise your glutes are asleep and they won't work. And I don't know what people are saying these days because I tend not to really pay attention too much to what's trending. But I do know that I found a more efficient way of waking up my glutes that doesn't involve endless glute squeezing exercises. So I hope to share that with you today, what that looks like. We're going to be trying to apply Gary Ward's first two rules of motion to experience glute loading in the context of how we walk. So Gary Ward, who created Anatomy of Motion in his book, What the Foot, he outlines 5 main rules of motion. The first 2 are very important for our exploration today. Joints act, muscles react, and muscles lengthen before they contract. And this is a little bit of a backwards way than conventional to think about how to work a muscle. So instead of thinking muscles act to create joint movement, we're going to be looking at this exploration today in terms of joints act to create muscle reaction. So what joint is it? The hip joint. When the hip joint moves, what muscles will react? The glutes. That's what we're looking at today. And muscles lengthen before they contract. This is unique to how our bodies move when we walk. This isn't necessarily how our bodies work at the gym. For sure, when you're at the gym, muscles contract to move the joint. But in gait, think of it as when you're walking, it's mostly a forwards traveling activity. And so our muscles have the role of when our bodies kind of fall into the tissues, the muscles lengthen to catch the joint movement, and then that lengthening stimulation to contract the muscle, which then propels us forward. So to simplify it, you can imagine that your muscles are like this elastic band. And when, let's say this is your glute, when we do one of the motions we'll be looking at today, it's going to stimulate that muscle to lengthen, giving it no option but to contract. And that is a very efficient way of walking. Usually when people are using their muscles actively to squeeze their way through the gait cycle, it tends to be a little bit less efficient, a little bit more energetically demanding to do that. So in order for us to be most efficient, we want to make sure that we can access the joint movement to elicit the muscle contraction, not actually contract the muscle to make the joint move. And we want to think about this in terms of the muscle lengthening, like loading a spring or loading a slingshot. So we call this muscle loading. So throughout the movements today, I'm going to be directing you to feel if your glutes are loading, not squeezing and contracting, but can you feel the glutes loading, which means that lengthening sensation, which is a little different than a stretch because it's going to be a bit of work. So it's not a passive stretch. It's lengthening under tension. The muscle's contracting, but it's contracting in a long position to decelerate the movement of the body. I hope any of that made sense, but don't worry, we'll be exploring it in motion coming up pretty soon. So that is the last intention, really, is to help you explore some exercises to regain triplanar hip motion with the hopes that that will stimulate the eccentric loading of the glute muscles, just like we'd like to see it in gait, so that with each step that you take, the glutes are doing the thing they ought to be able to do, which will give you better access to them regardless of your glute goals. So if your goal is to get stronger or develop your glute muscles to make them bigger, or you have some kind of discomfort or issue that you think is stemming from the glutes not being able to fire, then I hope that you'll get something out of this workshop today. So first of all, what is the hip? So the hip joint is, if I just stand up to show you, and maybe you can locate this on yourself, let's not take it for granted that we all know what the hip is. So your pelvis and your leg are the 2 bones which create the hip joint. So to find your pelvis, We have these two bones at the front here. If you just want to feel them for yourself, if this is new to you and you don't know what your pelvis is, it's okay. I didn't know what my pelvis was for a long time. So these are the two bones that stick out at the front. We'll just call these the pelvis bones. There's a socket in the pelvis in which the femur fits into, and that space between the femur and the pelvis where they fit together, that is what we'll call the hip joint itself. So the hip joint is the space between those two bones, not actually the bones themselves. So we'll be referencing the movement of the pelvis and the femur to give us the motion of the hip. The glutes, I think you all know what the glutes are, but I want to show you some images of the 3 glutes that we'll be looking at today from the Concise Book of Muscles. I really don't like this textbook, but it's the one I have on hand. So glute maximus, this is the big one, the one that everyone loves to train for size, for strength. And we'll be talking a little bit more about how to get that one to load when we start moving. Next, we have on the side of the hip, there is glute medius, and it connects from the iliac crest here to your femur, crossing the hip joint. It's a little bit smaller of a muscle, and it's more involved in lateral movement. And lastly, there is the little one underneath, the gluteus medius, and it's more tendinous and small, but it's a very similar function to the glute medius. So these are the 3 muscles that we'll be talking about when we're getting our glutes to load, as we're trying to find those 3 muscles. Now, I think it's important that we understand the difference between a concentric, a squeeze of the muscle, and a eccentric contraction of the muscle, which is that lengthening, loading sensation. So to show you what the concentric action is, the most common way people do a concentric glute contraction is a hip bridge. So if you'd like to try this now, if you put your feet flat on the floor and lie on your back and you think of lifting your butt up off the floor, this is what we call an extension of the hip and a glute contraction. So this would be one plane of motion to contract the glutes in, and I am definitely someone who used to do tons and tons of these to wake up my butt back in the day. I still do them, but not with the same intention. Now, another way that people often contract concentrically, meaning shorten the glutes, is like a side lying clam, which we're not going to be doing any of today either. But in the side lying clam, people lift the leg up, which is externally rotating the hip, and abducting the hip, which is really more working the lateral glute muscles, the medius and the glute maximus as well, and a little bit of glute minimus. And then there's the favorite side lying leg lift, which again is for more of those contracting, shortening the lateral glute muscles. So there's nothing wrong with these exercises, but these are concentric actions of the glutes. And our interest today is in finding ways of loading eccentrically. So if you caught that, I just named the 3 motions of the hip that contract the glutes: extension, abduction, and external rotation. And those 3 motions are I think my Bluetooth headphones just kind of disconnected and reconnected. So hopefully you can still hear me. Let me know if you can't hear me. What was I saying? Concentric contraction of the glutes. So to get an eccentric contraction, we need to think about what joint actions would actually lengthen the glutes. So we have the exact opposite: flexion of the hip, adduction of the hip, and internal rotation. So those three joint actions is what we're going to be exploring today in terms of getting the glutes to load and when and how that happens when we walk. So I made a really terrible diagram for you. I think it's all reversed. I don't know if you can read this at all, but I hope you can. I never know how these things are going to go. So we have a spectrum here, and this is representative of the motion that your hip should be able to go through from one end of that spectrum to the other, which with each footstep. In the middle, we have center or neutral. So if you've ever heard of like a neutral hip or a centrated hip, that's kind of the holy grail. That doesn't, we never really stay there that long in gait. We pass through that center point. And on one side, we have these joint actions that will lengthen the glutes, flexion, adduction, internal rotation. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have actions that will contract the glutes and shorten them, which are extension, abduction, and external rotation. With each footstep we take, our hip joint goes all the way from this end to the spectrum, passes through neutral, and gets all the way into this end of the spectrum, which lengthens the glutes like a slingshot and then contracts them back into this direction. So we always have one end of the spectrum to the other, one end to the other. So if we're only thinking about concentrically squeezing the glutes and contracting them, we're missing out on that whole other spectrum. And we're also missing out on that loading effect, giving that muscle no option but to contract. If you got my email, that was the primer for this session. I talked about the really bad analogy of you're the 8-year-old kid and it's Christmas morning, it's 5 a.m. and you want to get dad to wake up so you can go open your presents under the tree. So you're just like poking him like, dad, come on, it's Christmas. Like I was totally that kid. But dad just doesn't want to wake up, and no amount that you poke him is going to make him want to wake up. So what do? Well, you give him no option but to wake up. So maybe you go and set the Christmas tree on fire and then like, dad, get up now. And he's like, oh shit, I gotta get up because the house is gonna burn down. So you've created an environment in which dad has no option now but to wake up. And that's kind of what we wanna do with your glutes a lot. And that's a pretty terrible analogy, but it's the idea of creating no option for that glute but to wake up by putting it into its most lengthened state, giving it the stimulation to contract, which is an unconscious process. We don't have to deliberately squeeze our butt. We just trust that our bodies will do the job for us. Stop micromanaging and just work out and enjoy. So I think we ought to just talk a little bit about, before we get into the movements that we're going to explore today, what does closed chain movement of the hip look like? So I think you can stand up with me now, actually, and we'll use this as our assessment, as well as a little educational experience for those of you who have never really looked at what the hip does in a closed chain versus an open chain. By the way, how these sessions usually go is I'm just going to talk and move through the whole hour. And then when you have questions at the end, feel free. We're going to spend some time, like 20 minutes or so if we need to, or whatever, for you guys to ask any questions that might come up through the course of the session. So we talked about what does the hip do to load the glutes eccentrically, to lengthen them. One of the movements is hip flexion, which means bringing the leg up in front of you. In an open chain, this would be your hip flexion. So open chain meaning the foot's off the floor, and flexion refers to closing the space at the front of your hip. When we walk, when the leg swings through, that's how we get our one version of hip flexion. However, there's also a way of flexing the hip when the foot actually hits the ground. So just by virtue of having your leg in front of you, this hip is flexed compared to the other side. So just putting the leg forwards, know that that is flexing the hip. If you wanted to flex it even deeper, we would do an anterior tilt with the pelvis. So let's try your anterior tilts just to check in with that for today. An anterior tilt is when you take these two bones at the front of your pelvis and you tilt them forwards and down towards the anterior, the front part of your body. So give that a try, anterior tilt. And can you feel how when you do that anterior tilt, it's bringing these two bones closer to your thigh, which is closing the space at the front here. So flexing the hip. So just by doing an anterior tilt, we can further flex the hip and put a bit of length in your glutes. Now, the amount of range we're doing here isn't enough to feel a big lengthening in the glutes, but know that that is the general orientation of the muscles right now, long at the back, short at the front. Doing a posterior tilt, so tucking under, would do the reverse. This is how we would get your concentric contraction of your glutes. You can feel them probably shortening and tightening up as you tuck your pelvis under, which is lengthening the front, shortening the back. So if you put your foot forwards, already we have a hip flexion, lengthening the glutes. If you bend your knee a little bit deeper, that deepens the flexion of your hip. And if you add in an anterior tilt with the pelvis, that further increases the flexion of the hip, further loads the glutes, makes them longer. So that's our first plane of motion, the sagittal plane, which is everything you can see from the side view. Now, if you look at me from the front, or consider your body from the front view, remember there's the glute med and glute min that are more on the side, and this is the frontal plane, or everything that is side to side motion that you can view from the front. And this is where those lateral glute muscles, glute med and glute min, play their role when we walk. There is a phase of gait where your foot's on the ground, and a motion that happens is the leg that's in front, that pelvis will be higher than the leg that's back. That side of the pelvis will be lower. And so we call this the pelvis hiking. So we can experience the hiking of the pelvis by bending one of your knees and feeling the opposite side of your pelvis hike up. I'd like you to do that now and just compare your right to your left. So bend your right knee. You should feel the left side of your pelvis hike higher towards your ear. And just get a sense of, do you feel anything on this side of your hip, loading or stretching or any kind of sensation there? The side that's going up, that side, the glute med, glute min, even a little bit of glute max, all three are lengthening. And on the side that's going down, those muscles are shortening on that side of your hip. So just find maybe one side is easier or harder than the other. And do you feel muscles? Again, this is a small movement, so it might not be enough to really elicit a large feeling of the glutes loading unless you're very, very, very sensitive to your body. And lastly, we're going to consider our rotation, the transverse plane of the body, which would be able to be viewed from the top down or the bottom up. But since I don't have cameras overhead, just deal with this face-on view. So let's look at what happens if you rotate your pelvis. So if you block your shoulders and you rotate your pelvis so that your two bones are going towards the right, towards 3 o'clock, we're going to see that one side of the pelvis, the glutes, are longer and one side are shorter. Do you know which is which if we're thinking about the rotational plane of motion? So before I tell you what it is, maybe you can feel it for yourself. So if you rotate your pelvis to the right, is your right glute now long or short in this transverse plane of rotation? And what about your left one, long or short? So what is happening is if your pelvis is rotated to the right, the one you're rotating towards, so your right glute, is actually lengthening in the transverse plane. And on the opposite side, the side of the pelvis coming forwards, that side is going to be shortening in the transverse plane. Now, this is where it gets kind of confusing to think about muscles, which is why I don't often focus on muscles. Because a muscle can be lengthening in one plane of motion and shortening in another plane of motion. And just to bring that to light here, how confusing that can be, is let's say you're rotating your pelvis to the right. And I just said that your right glute now is lengthening in the rotational plane. However, it's now also getting shorter in the sagittal plane. On the other side, this hip, the glute is getting shorter in the transverse plane, but it's actually getting longer in the sagittal plane. So I don't want you to get too caught up in thinking about muscles, even though we're talking about a muscle group today. But it's much more simple to focus on the movement of the joint because we know what a joint does, but the muscles are a little bit more chaotic. I'll be walking you through what that looks like in motion, the glutes lengthening and shortening, but just know that it's so much easier just to focus on what the motion of the hip joint is. So when I'm rotating my pelvis to the right, the one that is I'm rotating towards, the right hip, that is internally rotating. And this hip, my left one, is externally rotating. And vice versa, if you rotate your pelvis to the left hip is internally rotating and the right hip is externally rotating. And because glutes have a triplanar function, we want to consider all three planes of motion. However, the glutes are rarely always long in all three planes. They're often short in one plane, long in another, short in another. And so we're going to explore motions that isolate those planes of motion, but know that that's not exactly how the muscle group functions when we walk. It's always all three planes happening simultaneously, but it just makes it more simple when you can isolate them, break into full body movements as you go out for a walk. So I hope that was a useful primer. You'll have to let me know. And why don't we go into, we're going to do a couple of concentric muscle exercises for the glutes, just to see how your glutes feel like they activate concentrically. And then we'll test again after and see if that feels any different, because it's always nice to have a bit of a before and after for you to see if anything was useful. So just like I showed you earlier, we're going to go through some common glute contraction exercises. And as you're doing these, I want you to gauge, describe in your own words for yourself, how does it feel for your glutes? So our first one is that hip bridge. So think of pushing your feet into the floor, lifting your butt off the ground, and it's like you're trying to stretch open your hips. So this is extension of the hips, sagittal plane hip motion, which should shorten the glutes. So do a couple in a row and just get a sense of how easy does it feel to get your hips to extend like this? How high are you coming off the floor? Do you feel your butt contracting? I know a lot of people complain that they have to do millions of reps to even feel anything in their butt, and all they feel is their lower back or something like that, or they feel their quads more. So just get a sense of how much am I feeling my butt, if that's the goal of this exercise, and how easy does it feel to lift your hips? That's our hip bridge, hip extension. The other one that I already showed you is our favorite side lying clam that I've done way too many of in my life with way too little reward to show for them. So in a side lying clam, your hips are stacked up and you're just lifting one knee up to the ceiling. So this is a combination of external rotation and abduction of the hip. Abduction meaning the leg coming away from the midline of the body. And the intention is to feel those lateral glutes, glute medius, glute minimus, a little bit of glute maximus. So do a couple in a row, and I want you to just gauge for yourself, how does this feel as a glute exercise? Am I feeling my glutes? How freely does it feel like I can access that leg movement without rolling my hips back? I don't think there's anything wrong with this exercise. I think it's a perfectly fine exercise. I don't choose to do this exercise, but I think it's okay if you do, if you have a good reason for it. So just gauge, how does this feel? And then finally, you can switch into, this feels like a Pilates sequence or something, but you can switch into a straight leg raise to the side. So again, your hips are stacked up and you're just feeling how much your leg can abduct without rotating it. So no rotation, just a pure abduction of the thigh. This one, again, lateral glutes should feel like they're contracting. You want to go until it feels like your actual hip starts to hike up, because that's now a pelvis movement, not a leg movement. So how does this feel? Do you get those muscles to activate? Does it feel good? How high does it feel like your leg moves before you start to move into pelvis movement territory? Just some general, very subjective assessments. In theory, our goal for today is to help you have better access to your glutes so that you can use them concentrically more effectively when you're doing training sessions or whatever it is that you choose to do with your butt. So stand on up now. Let's get into some exercises. So I have 4 main exercises to show you that emulate how our hip joints move through the gait cycle at different phases of that cycle and what the glutes are doing in 3 planes during those motions. So let's start with our sagittal plane, which is hip flexion. So I already showed you that to flex the hip, you simply need to put your leg in front of you. I'm going to do my side that's a bit more reliable to demonstrate, which is my left leg. So we're only going to do one leg together, and then I encourage you to explore your other leg on your own. That's just for the sake of time. Otherwise, if you know me, I go on forever, and I'm working on it. So put one leg forwards and know that this hip is now flexed. To flex it even more, you're going to start to bend your front knee and put your weight on your front foot. And the first thing I want you to check in with here is, what's your pelvis doing? So put your hands on your 2 hip bones. And we know in the sagittal plane, to get the hip to flex, which will load the glutes, we want an anterior tilt of the pelvis. So I'd like you to check in and see, is your pelvis actually anteriorly tilting? Do you feel these 2 pelvis bones rolling down and forwards towards the floor? Or are you actually tucking under? So the conception or the misconception is that tucking under your butt is the best way to activate it. And it is if you're going for a concentric contraction to squeeze it. But here, in order to get the glutes to load, we actually want to lengthen this whole area by anteriorly tilting. So find that anterior tilt of the pelvis. And what you ought to be able to feel is, as you bend your knee and bring your weight onto your front foot and allow for a little anterior tilt, is you get a sense of loading through your glutes. Now, there's a couple of details to refine as you do this. So we're just going to keep going forwards and back. And as you go, see if you can add in more and more and more of the details that I point out. Now, if you're not feeling much in your glute, maybe we need to deepen this crease at the front of your hip a little bit. So we'll exaggerate that and see how it goes. So now as you do this, I want you to reach forward slightly, like you're reaching down to a 45-degree angle, and allow that reach to counterbalance your pelvis. So your pelvis goes back as you reach forwards. Don't let your spine round like this. Keep your back the same shape, and just let yourself lean slightly forwards, and that counterbalancing with your body forwards and your hips back, you should feel how that closes the space here at the front of your hip, also known as a hinge at the hip. So by putting your body into this more bent forwards position, you should now feel a little bit more sense of the glutes contracting. So let's do a few in a row like that. Now, it's very important to make sure that your whole foot is on the ground here. I'm not going to go into the specifics of is the foot pronated or supinated and what that feels like, because that is way too long of a conversation for the topic of today. Unfortunately, we're just going to zoom in to the glutes and the hips, but know that there is a specific thing that your foot ought to be able to do here in order to get even more out of this movement. But for now, I want you to think about simply keeping your heel on the floor. Don't let your heel come off. Check in and make sure that your heel is not coming off the ground. And you want to feel a pretty even tripod of your foot. So you're not losing the outside edge of your foot off the floor. You're not losing the inside of your foot from the floor. Now, from another point of view, we're trying to keep this very pure in the sagittal forwards and back plane. So I want you to notice here, if you're twisting like this, which will not allow that glute to fully find its loading in the sagittal plane. So if you pretend there are laser beams at the front of your pelvis, just check, are yours pointing off to the side or are they pointing straight down to the floor? And see what it feels like. Maybe put your hands on your hips. Can you keep those two bones of your pelvis going straight forwards? And catch yourself if you start to twist. Keep it really pure in this plane of motion. Forwards and back. If you are someone who is really feeling this in your glutes, which is awesome, because not everyone does, and it takes a bit more troubleshooting, then feel free to take a break at any point. Otherwise, we're just going to do a couple more reps. Think of hips going back or your butt going back to 6 o'clock. Reach forward slightly. Bend your knee with your heel heavy in the ground. Now, when we're walking, we don't lean forwards like this. So I'd like you to try to find this now in a very vertically stacked position. So your head and your rib cage and your pelvis are all in a stacked column. And you're going to try to find that same feeling, bending your knee, keep your heel on the floor. Let your pelvis do a little anterior tilt, but don't let that anterior tilt turn into a big booty pop backwards. It's very small. The amount of actual anterior tilt is very small that our bodies can do before other body parts like this start to kick in. So what I like to do to help me stay stacked up and honest about what I'm actually doing is put one hand just on my xiphoid process here at the bottom of my sternum and the other at the bottom of my pelvis on the pubic symphysis. And if I can pretend that these 2 points and feel these 2 points stacked up over each other, then I know that I'm not going into an excessive amount of extension in my back or anything else kind of weird and off center. But a lot of people will do when they anterior tilt is instead of an anterior tilt, it turns into more of a spine thrust forwards. So check if this is you. If you're popping forwards with your rib cage, I want you to stay as stacked as possible. So it's a very small amount of anterior tilting in the pelvis. You don't want your butt to get behind you and exaggerate it that way. And you don't want your rib cage to pop forwards because that will just result in spine movement instead of hip movement. And we're interested in the hip movement. So try a couple more stacked up like this. If it's a challenge for you to feel any activity in your glutes while you're stacked up, head on top of pelvis, then go back to the reaching forwards version if that helps you to get a little bit more. And know that the long-term goal is that just by doing this knee bend and allowing your pelvis to anterior tilt accurately, there should be an immediate response in the glutes there if your body is sensitive to this. One more time, wherever you're at, whatever version you're doing. Feel the heel heavy in the ground, knee bending forwards. Anterior tilt of the pelvis. Not with your back. If you're feeling too much in your back, then maybe there is a little bit more spine movement than hip movement. Okay, so I'd like you to go for a walk around and let that integrate into your body. And just feel what that leg feels like compared to the other one. Just stand for a moment. And is there a difference in what that side feels like? Hopefully there is. Hopefully you got a sense of that glute loading. That feeling that you had there, hopefully, was the lengthening of the glute tissues, especially glute max in the sagittal plane, hip flexion. So our next plane of motion we're going to move into is that frontal plane, which when we were lying on the ground, that was that leg lift, the abduction of the leg. So if we wanted to lengthen the glutes, we would have to bring the leg back into center. If shortening the muscle is lifting the leg to the side, how do we get that muscle to lengthen in gait? By moving the hips. We already went through that, the hiking of the pelvis. The hiking side is going to be the lengthening side. So now let's go through a similar lunge that helps you to feel that lengthening of the tissues on the side. So that's more glute medius, glute minimus. So put that same leg in front. And we're going to go into that same bending of the knee, putting your weight in the front of your foot or putting your weight onto your front foot, but keep your heel on the floor. Now, we will talk a little bit about the foot here. I want you to make sure that your foot isn't rolling onto the outside and your knee isn't pushing over your pinky toe. It's very important. We actually want your foot to be a little bit moving into pronation. I won't go into too much detail about pronation because that's a whole day of my workshop, and that is also a whole online course by Gary Ward, Wake Your Feet Up. So you can learn more about foot mechanics there. But for today, what I want you to feel is just that the weight's going a little bit more onto the inside of your foot, definitely not to the outside of your foot, and allow the arch of your foot to spread into the floor a little bit. Now we want the pelvis of the front leg side to hike up. So let's go through that. As you bend your knee, I want you to allow your pelvis to sink towards your front leg. So it's like a teeter-totter. The front leg side of the pelvis is going to go higher and the back leg side is going to go lower. And you should feel that through the lateral glutes. You might need to exaggerate this a little bit. So to start, let's exaggerate it. So I want you to pretend there's something just to the side of you. If you have a chair or something, you can put a chair next to you. And I want you to think of sinking towards that leg and swooshing your pelvis to the side as if you're trying to touch something just to the side of your hip. Do that a few times in a row. Bend your knee. Make sure you aren't just putting your weight to the outside of your foot. There's a very good reason why we want the weight on your inside of your foot, but we won't get too technical about it today. And I want you to swoosh that hip to the side and feel the front leg side of your pelvis coming up higher to the ceiling. Keep bending your knee down your big toe. Go slowly in and out of that. These are dynamic movements. They're not necessarily stretches, but they're dynamic movements with the intention of loading a muscle. And notice how it might feel when you come back from that fully loaded position. It's almost like you get pushed back, like that loading of the slingshot idea. So we're loading all these lateral glute muscles, which then gives them no option but to contract back. There's nowhere else to go. You might also be feeling some quad, and that's okay too. But predominantly, it's these outer glutes. Now, if you're not really feeling them, there's a couple of things we can troubleshoot. Some folks, instead of allowing their pelvis to kind of sink in to that hiking and swooshing action, is they'll actually very actively contract the muscles of their abs to go like this. Can you see the difference between this and this? So one's more sinky and gushy, and the other is more grabby and pulley. So I want you to do the sinky, gushy version. It should feel like you're just sitting into those tissues, not trying to pull yourself up. Now, we also want to make sure that you're staying really cleanly in this frontal plane, not deviating, again, like doing a twist. So notice if you're twisting like this. A lot of people will do this, and they might get a little bit of loading in the glutes, but I can guarantee it'll be more precise if, again, we just focus for today on keeping your two pelvis bones to 12 o'clock. So see if you how much can you find that hiking of the front leg side of the pelvis without twisting. I also want you to make sure you're not tucking under. So remember that idea of tucking under the pelvis here, that's actually going to take away from this glute experience. So try to not tuck under your butt, not twist, just really purely get that hiking action, stinky and gushy into these tissues, which are now all stretching out from ilium to your thigh, and then contracting back. Let's do 1 or 2 more reps. I don't know about you, but my leg's getting tired. But I want to give you a solid chance to find these muscles. And if I'm spending too much time on one leg and you want to switch to the other, that's totally fine. Do you. Make sure you're not rolling to the side of your foot. Keep the weight mostly on the inner edge of the foot. Don't contract your arch here. Let your arch spread into the floor. And in the gait cycle, this muscle loading like this and this hiking action is very important for shock absorption. So I know I have one client who explicitly told me that she was trained out of accessing this hip hiking because her very religious upbringing told her that it was too sexual to walk with the pelvis going up and down. So she trained herself to walk without any of that motion up and down of the pelvis. And now, 60 years later, we're trying to help her re-experience that. And it's very challenging for her. And it's been very amazing to see how her body has transformed, just giving back that whole plane of motion to her hips again, having permission to do that. So go for a little walk around your room again after you've done that one side, or maybe you've done both sides, and just stand again on your 2 feet and notice how that feels. And as you're doing this, don't get too discouraged if you're not feeling that glute loading I'm talking about. Sometimes it takes a while. Sometimes there are some very precise little tweaks in how we're doing the movement that need to happen for us to feel the glutes. And it took me a long time to feel some of these too. So that doesn't mean give up. That just means keep going deeper, figure out why it's not going. For example, if you've ever had an ankle sprain and I'm asking you, get your weight on your front foot, and your body's like, I don't want to put my weight on my front foot, so I'm going to find all kinds of ways of avoiding moving my hip. Just notice if you're doing anything like that, just moving around the hip. So if you're not feeling the glute loading, your hip's probably not moving. There's probably a very good reason why your hip doesn't want to move in that way. And it might be related to something that happened, injury or an activity that you did for a long time. There's something there, and it just means get a little bit more curious about that. Okay, moving on to our last plane of motion. We talked about rotation, and the glutes, especially glute maximus, the big one, it will load when the hip internally rotates. So let's go through an exercise to help you feel internal rotation of the hip. Those of you who did the Liberated Body workshop, you'll recognize this. So you're going to stand with your feet side by side, and we're going to start to rotate your pelvis towards the leg that we're working with. So for me, I'm still on my left side. So internal rotation of the leg, we know most commonly as just turning the leg in like this. So that's done by keeping the pelvis still and rotating the leg inwards. But we can also get that same rotation by keeping the leg still and rotating the pelvis towards it. So if you look down, you'll see that it looks like your leg is now turned in. So that's how we're getting our internal rotation here. Because when we walk, we never really want to see this happening. That's not very useful. But we do get into internal rotation by allowing the pelvis to rotate towards that leg. So go for it. And what we're going to feel for is that as you twist your pelvis towards that leg, there should be this feeling of the whole leg twisting with you. So the thigh twisting in the same direction, your lower leg twisting in the same direction, your ankle here should be twisting in the same direction. The whole leg's twisting. If I'm going to the left of my pelvis, my whole leg is also twisting to the left. So to get the sense of an internal rotation, you're going to need to find that moment where it feels like, okay, my leg's done twisting. There's no more movement there in that twisting of the leg, but maybe you can twist your pelvis just a little further, twisting it over top of your leg. And that's what's going to give you the best internal rotation through the hip. And that should let you feel a very, not a big, intense sensation, but a nice, subtle, soft feeling of stretching through back here. So we're even getting into not just the glutes, but those deep lateral rotators like piriformis and all the friends that aren't as famous as piriformis, but those deep six muscles. So let's just talk through a few ways of troubleshooting this movement if you're not feeling very much back in the glutes. So as you're rotating, I want you to be aware again that your pelvis is purely twisting and not going into any other plane of motion. So the first thing you might notice is if you're letting your butt stick back like this, that might not quite give you the same feeling of being able to rotate through this hip. You might just get kind of jammed in the front there. So I want you to hold your pelvis in a bit of a tuck under, think like neutral pelvis, but don't squeeze your butt. Remember, the goal isn't to squeeze your butt concentrically. So you're going to have to use a little bit, maybe like a sense of lower abdominals doing that pelvis tuck instead of squeezing your butt, because squeezing your butt will restrict your hip movement. So see how that feels to make sure you're not sticking your butt behind you if that was something you were doing. Keep going in and out, feeling your pelvis twist over top of your thigh a little further, putting that internal rotation in the leg. Now, what a lot of people will do as well is as they rotate, they'll start to sink into the hip, which we just did, this hip hiking, pelvis hiking. But here we don't want to see that level change in that frontal plane. We want to just see a level pelvis rotating, pure rotation. So if you are noticing that you're sinking lower on one side or higher on one side, usually it's higher on the side you're twisting towards, try to level that out by pulling up the side you're twisting away from, or thinking of dropping down the side you're rotating towards. And stay very pure in that rotational plane. Now you might also start to feel some stretching at the front of your hip, the hip flexors, and that's also a nice sign here. That's totally plausible and good. So if that's what you're getting here, then that's totally great. I want you to make sure as well, as we're troubleshooting this rotation, that you're not just flinging your body to the side like this. This isn't really a rotation through the hip. This is just leaning and rotating through your spine. So again, I see a lot of folks who, instead of getting their pure motion from the hip, it's coming from their spine, other parts of their body. So make sure that you're just getting that hip motion really purely. Final thing to pay attention to is what your knee is doing here. So you want your knee to be straight, but not locked, hyperextended, not bent too much. Think of your knee staying stacked right over your heel. So you have a very vertical column that you're standing on and rotating over that vertical column. Each time you do this, try to get a little bit further, a little bit further. Remember, we want to find that range that gives the glutes no option but to contract back. So for you, that might end up being a little bit farther than what I'm going. Most people have a little bit more range of motion to move into here than they think they do, but it also doesn't need to be a huge range of motion in order to feel something. So let's do one more rep all together. Try to get the sense of some loading in the back of the glutes there. You're going to allow the weight to come into more the outside of your foot during this one. If that's happening already, just let that happen. Try to keep your whole foot on the ground as you rotate towards it, nice and slow, millimeter by millimeter. And take a little break. Go for a walk around. Come back to just standing with your feet side by side. You might feel very different on one side of your body if you've just been doing that one side. Do you feel like there's a little bit more blood flow coming into your hips and into your butt? Does it feel kind of tired, like you worked that side? It might feel that way. If you were struggling to feel your glutes, it might not feel that way. But again, the invitation is to investigate a little bit further. Why was I not feeling my glutes? It must mean the hip wasn't moving enough to stimulate the glute tissues. I don't know your answer why that might be, but that's something that maybe you can email me about after, we can talk about. So one last exercise we're going to do is actually to give your hip the experience of fully getting into the position where the glute would be contracted in 3 planes at once. But we're going to try to do this without contracting your butt. So what that means is we're now going to put the leg you want to work with behind you. So my left leg's back. And we're going to go into what's typically looks like a hip flexor stretch, but we're not going to think about it too much as a hip flexor stretch. We're going to think about it as a way of getting this hip to experience those 3 motions that will contract the glute, which are extension, abduction, external rotation. So let's go through that. So with your leg behind you, just lift your back heel slightly. Make sure your back knee is straight, not bending. To get your hip to extend, start with your butt behind you. This is not an extended hip, but by bringing your pelvis forwards and flattening out the front, you're going to feel a bit of a stretch in the hip flexors, which indicates that this hip is extending. Now, I want you to check in. Are you squeezing your butt to do this? Can you do this with a relaxed glute? You should be able to. It shouldn't really take a big glute contraction to extend your hip. If it does, there's probably a little bit of resistance you're pushing through, like you're pushing through the brick wall of your hip flexors. So you should be able to very easily bring your pelvis forwards, getting an extension of the hip, but just check, is my butt squeezing, or can I do this with a relatively passive glute? Just getting into hip extension without a butt squeeze. You shouldn't have to do a big butt squeeze to extend your hip when you walk. So can you feel that hip flexor stretching or loading to indicate you're getting that extension of the hip? Make sure your knee's not bending. Make sure, again, you're not sinking into your lower back. There are more details to pay attention to that I go through in my workshop, Liberated Body, but I'm not going to be too critical about technique for today. Now, if we want to look at our other planes of motion, so we have that extension of the hip, how would we shorten, or rather not shorten, but how would we get more of this position in which the glutes are shortening on this back leg? We want to do that hip or pelvis drop on this side. Remember, the pelvis dropping will shorten the glutes on that side, but it will also give a better stretch for the hip flexors. So I want you to try this lunge forwards and drop the side of your back leg, which is the same as hiking the side of your front leg. So you can see how these kind of go together. On this side, if we have the hiking of the pelvis, that's lengthening the glute, but I want you to focus more on the back side dropping now and see how that feels. See if that puts more of a stretch through kind of the groin part of your back leg. So we have 2 planes of motion. You're bringing your pelvis forwards which is shortening your glutes sagittal plane and then dropping that side of your pelvis down on the back leg is also going to be shortening the glute med and glute min. But again, you're not doing it by squeezing your muscles. You're doing it by accessing the movement of the bones and joints. And lastly, if we want to put a little bit more of that transverse plane shortening through the glutes, opening up the hip even more, we can add in the rotation. So if you start to rotate your pelvis towards your back leg a little bit, so if your shoulders are square to 12 o'clock, your pelvis is going to rotate a little bit towards the back leg, leaving your shoulders at the front. You should feel how that adds a little bit more opening in the front of the hip, but it's also more shortening the glutes at the back by adding in that external rotation. Think of the pelvis twisting and also the leg rotating externally in the socket here. And that should feel like you're getting more of an opening at the front of the hip, which means more shortening in all the glute muscles here. Actually, in this position, all of your glute muscles are shortening at the same time in all three planes. So this is one time where it is a little bit more simple because all of the glutes are shortening at once. But again, I want you to feel if you can do this without actually squeezing your butt really hard, because that makes it a very different experience. Imagine if every step that you took, you had to squeeze your butt, how much energy that would cost you versus just being able to move your pelvis into the tissues at the front of your hip. And then think about how all these muscles now are stretching, which is giving them the stimulation to eventually swing through. So go for a little walk around after doing that hip flexor stretch glute contraction experience. And just stand with your feet side by side. So I wanted to show you that more hip flexor loading exercise because remember, it's a spectrum. It's not just about loading the glutes or squeezing the glutes and contracting them. It's about being able to go from one end of the spectrum to the other, which is how we walk. We get into a footstep in which the leg's in front, the glute is loading, then we push off of it, and as the leg comes behind you, the glute is shortening. So at any point in the cycle, when we're walking, we have the front leg glute lengthening, back leg glute shortening, and we should be able to go back and forth, lengthening, shortening, lengthening, shortening. And I want you to think about that as like the original instructions for how our bodies were designed to move. We were designed to walk. We'll probably always be walking creatures on two legs unless we revert back to going on to all fours. That would be cool. Who knows how we'll evolve. But for now, we are bipedal creatures. And this is what our bodies were designed to do. So these are the building block joint movements that stimulate the glutes to load. And I hope that you can practice these exercises and use them as a way of accessing your glutes better and your hips better before doing anything. So whether that's doing a gym workout, squats, deadlifts, things like that, whether you jog or whether you go to dance classes, whether you're just walking, whatever it is that you do, I hope that this will help you to access your glutes better. So what I want to do now is ask you, if you're here, if you're still with me, I know some of you had to leave early, just type your name into the chat box because, as some of you know, I'm going to be doing a draw for everyone who attended live to win something super awesome. This month, my friend Jeanne Salas Levins, she has a double last name, I think. She's an amazing anatomy and motion student and practitioner who is a Fletcher Pilates and fascial fitness instructor. She's here in Toronto with me. And she's freaking awesome. She is a former National Ballet ballerina, National Ballet of Toronto. And she's now works with a lot of dancers, but also regular folks too, non-dancers who want to move better. And she uses anatomy and motion. And what she is donating, which is amazing, is a complimentary 55-minute movement assessment on Zoom. which I don't know if any of you guys have done movement sessions on Zoom, but you can actually get a lot out of them. I also do movement sessions on Zoom with this kind of work to help people troubleshoot their body's issues. And at the beginning, I was like, oh, this is kind of hard to do over a video because you can't see 360 degrees, you can't touch. But there's actually so much goodness you can get out of doing these sessions. So I'm really excited for whoever wins that session with her. Hopefully you have some stuff to troubleshoot, and she has a really good eye. So I really trust that you'll get something out of it. Another prize is I'm donating one spot in my Liberated Body workshop, completely complimentary for you. And that's coming up on Monday. So in the Liberated Body workshop, this is kind of a little taste of what we did in that workshop on day 3, which is all about the hips. So if you enjoyed this kind of work, then I think you really love Liberated Body workshop. It's 4 weeks and 4 days over 4 weeks, in which we go through an exploration of your body's joints and bones in 3 dimensions, as it ought to happen through the gait cycle based on Gary Ward's Anatomy in Motion. And for everyone who came live, I want to give you a special promo code to sign up for that workshop for $20 off. So I'll be sending that promo code out to you today, and it will be valid until the end of today. So if you like this stuff and you want to go a little bit deeper and explore your whole body in this sort of way, if you like this style and if you like me, even if you don't like me, if you like my style, that's good enough. So I'll be sending you that promo code so you can sign up for $20 off. Now, I'm really curious how that went for you. So we have a little bit of time where I'd like to get your experiences, answer any questions. How was that for you? Did you feel your glutes? Did anything not make sense? Feel free to type something into the chat box, or if you'd like to unmute yourself and chime in, then I'm happy to hear from you. So go for it. Or if you have to go, you can go. Did anyone notice a difference in how things felt?
That was really interesting, and I was trying to take some notes and remember all details, but I definitely felt something. I don't know if I'm feeling the right thing. Um, Feeling is so subjective, but hopefully, I don't know. I think that I have a lot to work with here. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us.
Yeah, you're welcome. I know I'm not sure how much information to give, because I know for me too, like I get easily overwhelmed when there's a lot going on in a session that's very conceptual and experiential. Um, so you say you're not really sure if you felt the right things. So what were you feeling?
I felt a lot of stretches. I have almost, I think I just realized like I have almost zero awareness of my glutes. So that's something that I can consider. But
Cool.
lots of stretchy movements. I think I'm like very flexible. So I can't tell between like, okay, is this a stretch or is this like my muscle? Like if I can feel the muscle twitch, then I can detect that I'm doing something right. But mostly I feel stretches.
And stretches in the glutes or somewhere else?
Well, depending on what the motion is, like the glutes, I'm not sure if I feel them at all, but definitely in the hips, like well, yeah.
hmm Okay, so that's something to continue exploring. Often when people say like, I don't know if I felt my glutes, probably you didn't. Or it was at a level that was very subtle that you might feel tomorrow, but in the moment, it wasn't the main thing standing out. So pay attention to how stuff feels tomorrow. It's for a lot of people, like I was talking through, they move other parts of the body more than the hips actually moving. So for example, when you're trying to do that pelvis hiking, a lot of people will just kind of lean to the side instead, and that will actually just stretch out the side of the body, not necessarily load the tissues of the glutes. So then
Mm.
they'll come back and be like, yeah, my side got really sore the next day. And I'm like, okay, so that probably wasn't your hip moving. That was probably you just leaning to the side and feeling like your hip is moving. So those are things to be aware of. And it's a process over time. of being able to move the actual part of the body we're aiming for. And it's a real challenge, especially for bendy people, because you have so many movement options that finding the one option and the one pathway we're looking for actually is like really challenging. So just keep chipping away at it. Thank you, Anna. I know some other people wrote some things in here. Do, 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 do. Yes, someone else has written, Veronica, it's okay to lift each hip a bit. Yeah, it is okay. A lot of people, it's amazing how many people are like, oh my gosh, I didn't know I was allowed to move my hips. Yes, you are. Felt a lot more of the hip flexor.
This must be an internal, external.
Oh yeah. Yeah, bendy is super challenging. I'm not really seeing a lot of straight up questions or anything, just a lot of really cool experiences. So that's awesome. Thank you for sharing with me what you're feeling. Did anybody have a really hard time with one particular exercise, like one of the planes of movement or one of those 5 exercises we did? Because there's probably always one that's a little bit harder than others.
I had a hard time just, I think, with all of them, like the when you talked about the foot being a tripod, excuse me, I really liked that thought, but it was very hard for me to stabilize the feet. I feel like even just walking around, the feet are, maybe it's a hypermobility issue, but I felt like I was having to focus more on the feet being stable so that I could stabilize the hips and the glute. So I don't know what that is, but it required a lot of thought and effort.
And is this for the ones where you're lunging forwards onto the front leg?
Yeah.
For more of the one with the hiking or the anterior tilting one?
Both.
Both of them.
Both,
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's not uncommon. I mean, a lot of us have feet that don't move very well. So when you move the pelvis, it kind of pulls the foot around, and that coordination might not be the exact one we're looking for. If you've had history of ankle sprains, it can always make the foot feel a little bit unstable. And there's not much I can really say too much for you now, but I invite you to look more into some of the online opportunities to learn about foot mechanics. So one I mentioned was Gary Ward's Wake Your Feet Up. It's a really excellent course that you get to go through a really detailed lesson in foot mechanics in pronation and supination. You get to explore whether or not you can do those motions, and you get to potentially get a pair of the famous wedges that everyone loves to help to modify how your feet are moving and improve how your feet are moving. You could also check out my workshop. Day 2 is all about pronation and supination and how that links up with the hip motions. And a lot of times, yeah, people just need a little bit of more direct focus on how the feet are moving, and that really helps to tidy up the movements of the hips at the same time and then link them together. But I don't go into as much detail of the specific mechanics as Gary does, so it depends on how deep you want to get into it. But there are some opportunities to learn more about that and potentially troubleshoot why your hip and your feet aren't communicating with each other as we'd like them to.
Cool.
I don't know if that was useful, but yeah, you're welcome for whatever that was worth. Okay, anyone is still here? Anything else before we wrap up for today? Any other questions, comments, experiences? Oh, can walk more freely. Yeah, but if you have a little bit of a sore back, yeah, could be from, like you say, compensating by, instead of the hip and pelvis being the main movers, a little bit more of the back. And that's not something that we can completely avoid. That was certainly my experience when I was learning how to do an anterior tilt with my pelvis. It's not that I should avoid doing an anterior tilt, it's just how I'm doing it wasn't really appropriate. So there are ways of modifying your environment that allow you to move more purely from your pelvis versus your spine pushing forwards. So using things like the floor, lying on the floor and practicing the anterior tilting to feel if you can do it purely will block you from thrusting forwards with your spine too much. These are some things that I've explored in other movement sessions. Some of my movement deep dive sessions, we go into these little troubleshooting details because there's so much to troubleshoot. Like it seems so simple, just move your hip, but actually that's incredibly challenging just to find pure motion of the hip when there's like 360 other joints that might want to do the hip motion for it. And that's all based on, you know, how we've learned to move through the course of our lives. So it's very individual as well. So it's tough for me to give any individual advice, but know that it's normal in the learning process of how to move those hips. We might bump into the challenges, like feeling your lower back a little bit. So go easy, go gentle. These aren't movements to do with 10 out of 10 intensity. It's more like 20% intensity and going for a subtle, small movements over time that become something bigger and more palpable of an experience. I think that's a good place to end for today, unless anyone else has a question or something to share. But I thank you all for coming out today. I am going to do the draw later on today. And then if you have won one of the things, I will send you an email about it. So stay tuned to your email. And tomorrow I'll also be sending out, or even later today, the recording of this session if you want to do it again and do it on the other side, because it's good to do this on the other side too. I encourage you to do the other side. Okay, so thank you for coming today. Thank you so much. I appreciate your time. I hope this was useful for you. Even if it wasn't useful, I hope you learned something. So have an awesome day and maybe see you next month or on Monday for the workshop. Have a great day.
Thank you, Monica. Bye.
You are welcome. Nice to see you, Stefan.
Nice to see you. More often from now on.
Yay, I hope so. Bye.
Bye. Ciao, Monica. Bye.